Just before we begin today's episode of The Daily, we would love to hear your thoughts on the podcast we do here at Sky News. So we have put together...
Emissions are only
more committed to this agenda than he is.
Struggling with the cost of living.
Just before we begin today's episode of The Daily, we would love to hear your thoughts on the podcast we do here at Sky News. So we have put together a short survey, which you can find in the audio tab on the Sky News app. It will, I promise, only take a couple of minutes of your time, and we are very grateful for all the feedback we will receive. Thanks very much for listening. Well, it certainly feels like we're a long way from the days of David Cameron hugging a husky.
People are already choosing electric vehicles to such an extent that we're registering a new one every 60 seconds. But I also think that, at least for now, it should be you, the consumer, that makes that choice, not government forcing you to do it. Because the upfront cost still is high, especially for families struggling with the cost of living.
The Prime Minister, with one eye on the election, the other on his backbenches, chose this moment to back away from long-standing pledges on the environment and the pursuit of net zero.
So to give us more time to prepare, I'm announcing today that we're going to ease the transition to electric vehicles. You'll still be able to buy petrol and diesel cars and vans until 2035. Even after that, you'll still be able to buy and sell them second-hand.
He also loosened the government's commitment to phase out gas boilers. Landlords and homeowners, well, they learned they won't now be facing more stringent energy-efficient regulations on their properties, none of which, according to Rishi Sunak at least, lessens one little bit the government's commitment to going fully carbon neutral.
We won't take the easy way out. There will be resistance, but we will meet it, because I am determined to change our country and build a better future for our children. Nothing less is acceptable.
The reaction, well, it's been mixed. Cheers from the net zero sceptics, boos from the car industry, hisses from the most environmentally minded Conservative politicians. And no doubt the Prime Minister is just a little rankled that the announcement was leaked, meaning the speech announcing the delay to the 2030 petrol and diesel vehicle deadline itself had to be brought forward. I'm Niall Paterson, and in this edition of the Sky News Daily, we will be asking, why are the Conservatives turning a lighter shade of green? Joining us today, our science correspondent Thomas Moore. Thomas, good to see you.
Hey.
And a very warm welcome to Jack Blanchard, Politico's UK editor, but very soon to co-host the new Politics at Jack and Sam's podcast with Sky's deputy political editor, Sam Coates. Jack, very warm welcome to the podcast family.
I'm delighted to be joining the team.
You can be quiet for a couple of minutes because I want to talk to Thomas first. And Thomas, on the announcement itself, this is very significant. Did it come entirely out of the blue for you?
We've seen increasing noises coming from government that they are perhaps not as committed to the direction of travel as perhaps previous governments under Boris Johnson and Theresa May, who talked about the importance of net zero and ramped up the commitments, and not just the direction, but also the pace of change within the economy. I think what we're seeing now is a realisation, just as it did for David Cameron, and he did talk about green crap and rode back on some of the commitments he'd made when he did hug that husky. And I think the cost of living crisis has forced the government into this new tack. Now, green groups would say this shows a lack of leadership, that in fact you need to stand on the world stage and make good on the commitments you have made. But it does look like there has been a softening on the policy, and some would say that it's completely stalled.
Thomas, in as few words as possible, just define what net zero actually is.
Net zero is not the same as carbon neutral. It goes well beyond that. So it's reducing by as far as possible all the emissions in your country. There is a small amount that the policymakers accept will be unavoidable from some industries, such as concrete perhaps, and perhaps some aviation. But the idea then is that you make up for it in other ways by sucking carbon out of the atmosphere, for example, and the end result is that your emissions are zero.
I suspect that the most kind of eye-catching measure that we have heard today will be the cars. You know, no new diesel and petrol vehicles now from 2035 instead of 2030. What exactly is the link between cars, their emissions and net zero? I mean, isn't that more a clean air issue?
Fossil fuel cars produce carbon dioxide as they burn fuel. That is the internal combustion engine. There was a two-phase move towards banning these cars because of the link, not just with air quality, but also because of their damage to the climate. In 2030, there would be the end to the pure diesel and petrol cars, those conventional engines we've been driving up till now. Between 2030 and 2035, you could still drive a hybrid, and then from 2035, it had to be 100% electric. Now, if the Prime Minister is saying that from 2035, it will still be all electric, that puts us on a par with the EU.
Jack Blanchard, I mean, isn't part of the problem that Rishi Sunak faces here that, our commitment to net zero is enshrined in law? And unless I'm being a bit daft, he's not about to pass a bill removing that. So if we lessen our commitment to net zero in this area, we're going to have to accelerate in other ways, aren't we?
I suspect that's a problem that Rishi Sunak thinks he'd love to be addressing after the general election when he's won it.
Yeah.
I mean, this is a guy who's thinking extremely short term at the moment for very obvious reasons. He's 18 points behind the polls and there's an election next year. So he needs to do whatever he needs to do to stay in power. Downing Street are being completely clear that they are sticking to that 2050 net zero target. They insist there is absolutely no shifting of that, the one that is enshrined in law. They're saying this is about the path to get there. Now, as you say, if you take a different, slower path, then you wonder how you're going to get there in time. But, I guess their thinking is that 2050 is still a long time away. Really, what they're trying to do here is speak to two sides of the Conservatives' rather fragile or increasingly fragile electoral coalition. There are people who vote Conservative or people who they want to vote Conservative who are sceptical about net zero. They don't want to be spending or can't afford to be spending vast amount of sums on new electric vehicles and new heat pumps and all the rest of it for their homes. But at the same time, they're trying desperately to hang on to those more affluent, liberal, Democrat-facing seats in the South where people are, particularly pro net zero typically. And so this is a sort of fudgy way of signalling to both sides, or at least they hope it is, that Rishi Sunak is on both of your sides.
Yeah, I agree. It could be a green fudge. Just on the dates, I mean, there are some international and legal commitments that kick in well before 2050. So it's much sooner than perhaps you would realise. So there is an international agreement, the Paris Agreement, where all the world leaders agreed to make commitments by 2030. And ours was that we would reduce emissions from the 1990 levels by 68%. Then we made a legal commitment that by 2035 there would be a 78% fall in UK emissions. That's a big ask because at the moment those emissions are only down by 46% from 1990. So we've got a long way to go. And the Committee on Climate Change, who mark the government's homework, are very concerned about the pace of change.
The irony in all of this, Jack, is that, the Prime Minister was bumped into making this announcement because the detail of the plan was leaked. And, of course, he's made it on a day when the UN General Assembly is meeting and is talking about climate change.
The timing is toe-curling for Rishi Sunak. He really didn't want this to come out today. He's had to have an emergency call with his cabinet to brief them about it because, cabinet ministers do not like learning about big shifts in government position from the media rather than from the boss. And so that will not have gone down well either. I mean, the rumours have been circulating about this in Westminster for days. So quite why Downing Street thought they could keep this quiet for so long is a bit of a mystery to me when you're doing something so significant and that's obviously going to attract so much attention and so much controversy as something like this. I think you have to remember, though, Neil, that this is kind of where Rishi Sunak always was. When he was Chancellor, he was very sceptical about spending lots of money on climate measures. He knows he's got this electoral coalition to try and hold together, and he knows he can't just abandon the voters who feel very strongly about net zero. But in his gut instinct is not to be, a real climate warrior in the way that even someone like Boris Johnson, Theresa May were much more committed to this agenda than he is. And so I think he'll probably feel more comfortable getting to this point. And they think it's a path to getting them in a better place for an election, if not perhaps on course to win it yet.
Well, what has been the reaction then, Jack, from politicians? I mean, I've seen, Zach Goldsmith, former climate minister. You had Alok Sharma, the chairman of COP when it was in Glasgow. I mean, both of them have come out and been really vociferous in their anger about it. But I suspect that the majority of the Conservative ranks will be quite sanguine.
I think they're quite divided on it, honestly. I mean, I think, there are very different views on the climate and how quickly we need to take action on it within the Conservative Party. And so some people are over the moon that this is the new course the Prime Minister is setting, although they'd probably like him to go much further. And others are absolutely raging about it. There isn't really any direction he could go in on climate stuff where that isn't the case due to the range of views.
Thomas, what about the reaction from industry? I've seen some very interesting statements emerging, particularly from those who manufacture cars. It kind of feels almost as if they didn't know that this was coming.
It does look like the government had made promises to the battery gigafactory being built in Somerset and also to the owners of the Mini in Oxford that they would remain committed to this phase out of petrol and diesel cars. And if that's beginning to waver, then the big investment decisions that companies are making are looking a little bit dodgy. Ford has said that our business needs three things from the UK government: ambition, commitment and consistency.
I mean, they're basically saying the government has neither ambition, commitment nor consistency.
Yeah, exactly. This undermines all three, they say. Others are saying, actually, we've already made a business plan to go for 2030, so we will go faster than any ban as such. And I think what we need to remember is that there are other factors at play here, that China is really pushing ahead with electric cars, that they dominate that market already. The government heavily subsidises the industry there, and they own the supply chain from the raw minerals to all the way through to the finished product. When you've got command of the complete manufacturing process, you can really set prices and dominate the market. If the UK car industry begins to waver and doesn't keep up with the pace, you will find that Chinese electric cars dominate our roads in the future.
We will pause there for just a moment. When we come back, however, we will be examining whether or not investment into green technologies may well suffer as a result of this. But more than that, whether the British public have genuinely ever understood that commitment to net zero. We'll be back in a second. Welcome back to The Daily. Our science correspondent Thomas Moore is still with us. So too, Jack Blanchard, Politico's UK editor, also hosting a podcast. Everyone's got a podcast these days, with our deputy political editor Sam Coates at some point in the future. Jack, to you first, because we want to get our money's worth out of you today. I mean, just in terms of investment, I mean, surely this is going to put the stymie on significant, serious investment in green technologies in this country. And probably, I would imagine, there will be a few companies complaining about the fact that they have already invested significant amounts of money based on this 2030 date.
Only a week or so ago, BMW announced a huge investment in the UK in terms of, building new electric vehicles here. I would love to know how much they knew about what was being announced. What the government would say is that the direction of travel is still set. We might have moved the dates a little bit, but there's no doubt where all of this is heading. Are we really thinking that car manufacturers are going to stop focusing their attention on developing EVs? I don't think that's going to be the case. Whether we see that sort of direct collapse investment, I'm not sure. We saw in that Ford statement you mentioned earlier, what companies hate is uncertainty. They hate government switching around and changing their mind and saying, we'll do this by this. Oh, actually, we're going to do this by this date instead, because they make very, very, very long-term plans. And so I think what this sort of switch around does is it just adds to that air of uncertainty about investing in Britain generally, and that is a much bigger problem than just the green sector. That is something that the political instability we've seen in this country over the past couple of years has already created this climate.
I suppose though, Thomas, if we are looking for a silver lining in the cloud, might it come in the form of infrastructure? I mean, this country is not ready yet, clearly, for EV vehicles on the scale that we will be seeing a decade from now. I mean, does this just perhaps buy us a little bit more time to get those charging points in place, to upgrade the network?
I think the hope will be is that the market is going to sort this out.
You live in hope, don't you?
Well, look, it's based on fact. If you look at, say, solar and wind, the price has dropped by 85% since 2010.
Wow.
It's a huge drop. So it is now much cheaper to generate electricity from green tech than it is from gas. Now, you look at computers too, again, a big drop as efficiencies are gained within factories and installations. And that too could happen within cars. It could happen with the heat pumps, that in fact those become as cheap, if not cheaper, than old tech. In that case, why wouldn't you buy a greener car or a greener means of heating your home, and then everybody wins.
Jack, to take it back to the politics for a second, that Uxbridge by-election, on the outskirts of London and the ultra-low emission zone, and that apparently being the tipping factor in the Conservatives retaining that seat, that seems to have shaped an awful lot of the politics that we're going through at the moment. And I can't quite work out whether politicians not being green is a good thing or politicians trying to be green is a good thing. I mean, you've got Simon Clarke, Redwall Tory MP, saying that his constituents want investment in the green economy. You move a few seats along the Conservative benches and I'm sure you find someone saying exactly the opposite.
They are completely divided on it, and it's not actually as constituency-based as you would think. There's a slight sort of caricature that up in the so-called Red Wall in the north of England, there's all these sort of Neanderthal people who, just think that like climate change is all made up and blah, blah. It's not like that at all. And endless polling and focus group shows that people are just as worried about climate change in the north of England as they are in the south of England. However, there is definitely an issue around affluence and how much, you don't tend to see lots of very, very expensive, as they still are, electric vehicles driving around the more deprived neighbourhoods of this country for obvious reasons. And so being forced in that direction is definitely something that people are concerned about, even if they're also concerned about the planet. You talk about Uxbridge, it's a really interesting one, that. I mean, don't forget, this is a by-election that the Conservatives won by a few hundred votes. It could so easily have gone the other way. And you do wonder what sorts of conversations we would have been having since the summer since then. I think it's probably a little bit overblown, that. I do think, as I said before, this is something that Rishi Sunak believes in his heart that is the right thing to do from an electoral point of view. I think he has campaign chiefs telling him that he needs to find dividing lines with Labour between now and next year, and that probably migration will be one of them, and that this could be another one, that there's a way of framing this debate that makes Labour look sort of like zealots, like people who are going to cost you a lot of money, albeit presumably far in the future, and that the Conservatives are much more sensible, practical, pragmatic, on your side, and that is the kind of messaging that could start to win back some of the votes that they so desperately need to find.
Isn't this all Theresa May's fault? I mean, wasn't she the one who, passed into law this commitment to net zero by 2050 without anyone really understanding how we would do it, or indeed, perhaps almost as important, how much it was going to cost all of us?
Well, there's a school of thought that there's a lot of things that Theresa May's fault. I don't really buy into that, honestly. I think trying to be too prescriptive in 2018 or whenever it was about how exactly Britain gets to that point in 30 years' time with emerging technologies probably was not a realistic thing to do. What we're talking about now is going to change again anyway, because things move very quickly in the emerging technology sphere for obvious reasons. So I'm a bit more sympathetic to Theresa May to that. And I would say as well that even though we're having this debate, and clearly this is going to be a key debate over the next 12 months to go into the election, none of the main parties are talking about scrapping her target. It's not a mainstream political opinion in this country, and that's because most people support it.
But Thomas, I mean, do people genuinely understand the effort that we are going to have to go through, the amount of money that we're going to have to spend, the changes to our lifestyle, that getting to net zero by 2050 would actually entail?
The changes to our lifestyle are probably less than you might imagine. We just drive electric rather than the petrol. We charge up at a plug rather than a petrol station. We can adapt to that.
You rip out your gas boiler, insulate your house, stick solar panels on the roof, recycle more.
Insulating a house saves you money. Well, who doesn't want to do that?
Well, the person that hasn't got 10 grand to insulate their house.
No, you're absolutely right. And there you can look at government grants to help those who can't afford it. But that's the kind of support that could have happened when energy prices went through the roof, but didn't. That was a choice the government made. The danger is that we see this as a revolution, a major upheaval. And in fact, what you're really doing is creating a cleaner future where people can live in cities and not die sooner than they should do because of air quality, where we can have a future that is less damaging to the planet, and we're handing on that planet in a better way to the next generation. And also, we are providing a new economy. This is an opportunity for the UK to take leadership and really develop the technologies that are going to be in all of our lives over the next 50 to 100 years.
Jack, though, just a kind of a final thought from you. And again, everything now does seem to be being viewed through the prism of the forthcoming general election, whenever that might be. But I'm just wondering what Rishi Sunak's kind of plan is here. You've got Keir Starmer is stronger, more vociferous, it would seem right now, on these green issues. Rishi Sunak, apparently, again, just preaching to the base of the party. How much can he actually gain from this in electoral terms? I mean, when you're talking 20 points of a difference between the parties, I mean, seriously, does he genuinely think that there are that many votes in this?
I certainly don't think he thinks that the speech today will sort of turn around his electoral fortunes and somehow put him back in front again. No, but it's part of a new, more aggressive Rishi Sunak that has been relaunched this autumn to make a final push to try and turn those polls around and win that election. And this is just one part of that plan. First, we saw the moves in cabinet, and now this, and there will be more big moves over the next few weeks. Labour have made themselves a very small target under Keir Starmer. They haven't really committed to very much at all, and certainly not in the areas where the Conservatives want to paint them as being out of kilter with public opinion. But Rishi Sunak and his number 10 team have identified this and migration as key areas where he thinks he can push them into that corner, where he thinks he can make steps that they won't be prepared to take that actually will prove popular with the public once he gets on the campaign trail and makes that message time and again. Now, there are pollsters who will tell you that this is crazy, that basically the public are very concerned about climate change and that net zero is a very popular policy and he should leave it alone as it is. That is not the thinking in Downing Street, and I'm afraid we'll just have to wait and see if he's right.
Well, let's just ask a kind of a political question of our science correspondent, Thomas. As your reporting over the past few years has illustrated, we are only going to be talking about these issues more and more. Anyone who doesn't have a significant, well thought out, green policy platform, they won't be fit to run the country, will they?
You have to look at what has happened over the last 2 years with the weather, that it has become more extreme. Scientists believe that it's happening faster than they had predicted. So the governments do need a plan on how they're going to get to net zero. And it's not about leaving it to the last minute. There are milestones which are really important along the way. Now, if governments are wavering on that, it sends out a signal to other countries. The UK was seen as a climate leader, and that is the danger, that they too will say, well, if the UK's not doing it, then we won't either. And everything then starts to unravel, and action we don't take today needs to be taken in future, or the climate will become increasingly unstable, and delaying action means that it becomes more expensive.
Thomas Moore, Jack Blanchard, thanks both very much. Pleasure to have you on the podcast.
Thank you. Cheers.
Thank you.
And that is your lot for this edition of The Daily. We'll catch you next time.